Hey everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. 43 events, 110 speakers, as Al Pacino would say. Wow! We have about 6 events left, and I'd like to clue you in to what they are. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., Debt After Graeber with Max Haven, Cassie Thornton, Radhika Desai, Lee-Claire Laberge, and Andrew Ross. At 3 p.m. tomorrow, we have What Just Happened, which is an inquiry into the bizarre events of the last year, from pandemic to attempted coup to the George Floyd Uprising, analyzed by Joshua Clover, Jody Dean, Theoria Francos, Idris Robinson, and Nikhil Pal Singh. At Saturday at 10 a.m., Neither Settler Nor Native. That's a new book by Mahmoud Mandani, and he will be there along with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Samara Esmer, and Ted Swedenberg as the moderator. On Sunday at 11 a.m., Rethinking the Chinese Cultural Revolution with Alessandro Russo, Andrea Piazzaroli Longobardi, Chris Connery, and Assad Haider. And on Sunday at 5 p.m., Feminist International, How to Change Everything with Veronica Gago, Michael Hart, and Kathy Weeks. And on Monday, on May 31st at 11 a.m., Marx for Cats, a radical bestiary. Lee-Claire Laberge will be there with her cats. So come and see one, come to all of them, but more important, go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and give us some money, whether you think the money is the value form, or as Borges calls it, a repertory of possible futures, or as Marx says, your access to society. Whatever it is, we need it, because you know what? Being a commie festival, we don't get any institutional funding. So we depend on the kindness of strangers. We're like Blanche Dubois. So please go to our website and you'll find a button that says donate. And one link is to Fan the Flames of Red May, which is our GoFundMe. And we also have a Patreon where you can be a patron at $3, $5, $10, $20 a month. So find the contribution that suits you, and please, we want to keep doing this madness. We've managed to do it for 5 years. This is our 5th anniversary. It's pretty amazing that we've been able to pull this off at this level for so long. And next year we go back live again, fingers crossed, with all keeping our online component too. So it should be pretty interesting. So without further ado, all the boring stuff is over now. I want to welcome a panel that I wish we weren't doing, because that would mean that it wouldn't be the problem that it is. But it's counterinsurgency policing, and I want to introduce the host of this panel today, a Red May alum, Charmaine Chua, who's an assistant professor of global studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, scholar of global supply chains, logistics, and anti-imperialist struggles. She organizes with Amazonians United, the Abolition Collective, and the Cops Off Campus Coalition. Charmaine, welcome back to Red May.
Thanks, Phil, and thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Red May team for putting together such an incredible month of events. I know all of us are incredibly grateful for that. And hi, everyone who's watching on the YouTube channel. It's a real honor to moderate a panel of all-stars, of scholars, organizers, practitioners, thinkers, intellectuals who seamlessly incorporate their intellectual histories and thinking and theories in with movements on the ground. And so I'm really excited and privileged to be able to moderate this panel today. Unfortunately, Sam Pri Gonzalez, who would be calling us from Minneapolis, may not be able to join us. She's going to be calling, if she can, from the hospital due to an emergency. So unfortunately, well, I hope she'll be able to participate, but if not, just Sam and hope that she's doing okay. I want to just acknowledge as a start that I'm calling in from Santa Barbara, which is the traditional and ancestral lands of the Chumash and Island Chumash peoples, and I pay respect to elders past and present. So this panel mobilizes personal witness and path-breaking scholarly research to confront the problem of our time, the police. More specifically, the police as a group. Since Ferguson, the internet has disseminated iPhone videos of murders by individual cops. But only rarely do we see, as we did for the entire month of the George Floyd Uprising, what happens when a lot of cops assemble together and metamorphose into an autonomous strike force, with no more allegiance to anything outside of itself than the Freikorps in Weimar Germany or the mercenary companies who marauded through Renaissance Italy. If this is the wrong kind of group, as we all think it is, a sociopathic group in fact, then simply cutting some funding or removing some bad apples doesn't address the problem. What actions would address the problem and how do we make them happen? So we're going to go in the order of Dr. Omedy Ochieng, Paige May, Paul Passavant, Sam Gonzalez, if she's able to join us, Stuart Schrader, and then we'll end with Dr. Travis Harris. What I'm going to do, just because there's so many speakers and we want to maximize their time, you're here for them, not for me, is that I'm going to cut and paste their epic bios into the YouTube channel chat so that you can read their bios for yourselves. And so we can maximize the kind of time that we have to have a Q&A and have a conversation with each other. So they'll each speak for about 10 minutes on the relationship between counterinsurgency and policing. I'll pose about 2 questions at the end, and then we'll open up for audience Q&A. So please feel free to drop comments, questions, whatever you want in the YouTube channel chat. So Dr. Ochieng, please go ahead.
Many, many thanks to Philip and to the great organizers of Red May and to Charmaine and to comrades here. Thank you for joining me today. The police are primarily a counterinsurgent force. To describe the police as a counterinsurgent force means at least 2 things to me. First, that the police as constituted within the United States polity function outside juridical processes of political control. Their actions are immunized from formal political, procedural, and legal processes. Second, and most importantly, police are the shock troops of counter-revolution. They exist to terrorize and subjugate designated populations, to carry out assassinations of leaders seen as threats to established order, such as Fred Hampton, or more recently, we know about Michael Reynolds, to defeat or make unimaginable resistance to the status quo, to keep certain populations imprisoned or immobile in certain jurisdictions while ensuring the circulation of certain populations and goods going through market-approved pathways. And of course, to plunder, to extract and accumulate wealth, both for themselves and the capital that they serve. In the event that various elected political leaders in the US have spoken of defunding or investigating the police, as happened, for example, in New York under Mayor David Dinkins, the police have been known to unleash violence, or in some cases, to outright overthrow elected officials. For instance, what we know about in Portsmouth, Virginia. Not many in the left will, many people in the left will readily accede to the notion that the police are a counterinsurgent force. But it's telling perhaps that the ideas that have received the most traction in response to police counterinsurgency are those that have tended to gloss over it, or have tended to skip over what it means for organizing. Some of this is very predictable, of course. Liberal sources will tend to promote theories of change that focus on changes in policy and that are dedicated to lobbying politicians. I'm much more alarmed by ideas that claim Black radical traditional pedigree. Not because of the ideas themselves, but because of the narrow imaginations of certain currents within the left. For me, particularly, and this is the moment here for antagonism, is one such proposal for me is community control of the police. This proposal advances the idea that police power will be shifted from the current system to one in which every district will control its police force. And this will be brought about by placing the police in each district under the direct control of a civilian police control board. There's much more, obviously, to this proposal that I am not able to go into here. I'm willing to engage more in Q&A. Now, my critique of community control can be boiled down to 3 problems. First, a strategy that pins its hopes on the winning of election ballots across the United States to implement community control of the police strikes me in many ways as not taking in seriously the idea that the police is an occupying colonial force waging a war of extinction, and therefore that there are limits to that kind of ballot structure, balloting or voting for that kind of structure to emerge. Second, community control of the police advances the local district as a site for gaining power, and from there implementing change. Again, that does not strike me as an analytic that takes seriously the idea of the US as a global empire. Its police a quilting point for consolidating and expanding the frontiers of capitalism, of white supremacy, or patriarchy. Third, for all the insistence that of various advocates for community control that they seek to abolish existing police departments and put in place entirely new police departments, or entirely new police structures, policing structures, they're still invested in policing as a system. And this last point speaks to an interesting dimension for me, as I have read several accounts of community control of the police, which is the blank incomprehension at anarchist political practice. Now, these comments aside, I'm not particularly invested in the whys and wherefores of community control of the police. To the extent that I have offered a critique of it, it's only insofar as it emblematizes the assumptions of certain currents within the left. And of those assumptions, few have concerned me lately as much as the idealism and voluntarism awash within the left. A materialist account of police counterinsurgency, I want to say, should start with what Stuart Hall described as a confrontation with our historical conjuncture. We should be attentive, of course, to the historical roots of the police in controlling and terrorizing the enslaved and wage labor. But materialist praxis cannot stop there. It also ought to examine the contemporary exigence that not only reveals the conditions and constraints of police counterinsurgency, but also informs the sort of resistance adequate to it. That conjuncture, as I see it, should at least take into consideration the following 4 axes: the economic, the political, the social, and the ecological. First, economically, there's likely an irreversible decline in growth and profits under late capitalism. We should expect then an even larger bifurcation between what the sociologist Michael Mann describes as the despotic versus the infrastructural dimensions of the North Atlantic state. On the one hand, the despotic dimensions of the state will be ramped up to horrendous levels. We should expect even more brutal policing, evictions, incarceration, and genocidal wars. At the same time, the infrastructural dimensions of the state, roads, bridges, energy grids, buildings, plumbing, ventilation, air distribution systems, and so on, will decay. One upshot of that is that radical strategy cannot be aimed at the purely political. Another thing is that even as much as we're going to have these zones of abandonment, we're also going to have opportunities in those zones for different forms of ungovernability. Secondly, politically, even the ideological pantomime that passes for democracy in the United States and elsewhere in the West will be abandoned in favor of brutal ethno-supremacist and ethno-religious politics. Under such conditions, those who prioritize electoral and policy-based politics will be given to upholding a fuss, even more than is the case right now. Third, socially, the networks of association that are at once the loci of socialization and wellsprings of meaning will fray even further. It's not just that neighborhoods, schools, places of worship, and workplaces will be subjected to even greater and more murderous surveillance and violence. This is true, but with more evictions, more precarity, more wars, our eyes should be focused on what Michael Denning described as wageless life, what Mike Davis describes as a planet of slums. Forging solidarity under these conditions will be an even greater challenge than ever. And then greater questions of reproduction, care work, and interdependence will be particularly salient under those conditions. And lastly, ecologically, planetary life will be increasingly nasty, brutish, and short as the consequences of the capitalist scene become even direr. The temporalities of incremental changes through policy making will be an invitation to ecofascism. So anyway, any serious strategic analysis ought to begin by specifying how the conditions of possibility of capitalist decline, ethno-supremacist ascendance, social fragmentation, and ecological collapse create at once even deadlier forms of police counterinsurgency, even as they make possible a possibility for some kinds of a medley of strategies for tactical resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Omedy. Paige May, you're next.
Yeah, so I don't know, I'm not an academic. I'm gonna start there. I'm not an academic. I've never been to grad school. I'm a middle school teacher who does community organizing for abolition. And I don't have, I organize young people specifically, young Black people. When I say young, I mean like ages 6 through high school. And I've learned a lot from those young folks. I also host a podcast where I interview myself and my co-host Monica Trinidad, interview organizers, abolitionist organizers about the books that have influenced them. And I take those ideas very seriously. I really dislike Zoom panels because I can't see the room and I don't know who I'm talking to, and I haven't attended Red May before. And so I really like Q&As because I want to speak to what folks are most interested in. But the term counterinsurgency is honestly hard for me as a framing for policing. So I'm going to make some comments. I hope they're relevant and useful to folks. If they're not, there's room for a Q&A. But generally, the way that I approach my work is as an abolitionist. So when I say that I'm an abolitionist, a lot of times what people are hearing is that I believe in a world without police and prisons. And that is absolutely true. For all the reasons that were just said. I also don't know if I can swear on this, but I cursed a lot, like fuck the police. Like, and I've known that for a very long time. And I think there's lots of books and lots of great arguments for why that is. And I think that policing is deeply directly, traceably, unobjectively tied to anti-Blackness, but also, of course, right, I would say broader systems of capitalism and colonialism that are very much tied to anti-Blackness. So anyways, what I think about when I say I'm an abolitionist, what I actually mean is more specific than just abolishing police and prisons. I mean, I am an abolitionist and I hear that word, and what was hard for me when I first started hearing that word as a Black person was that it reminded me of slavery. And I didn't want to, I felt like people were telling me I was a slave. And that there was something too similar, and that was really hard. And then when I work with young Black people, there's this, it's very, the fuck the police, fuck 12 is like, that takes no convincing, right? But the moment of thinking about how deep this shit goes, that can be really painful. And that's why I am now a literacy teacher, but I started as a social studies teacher. And I think that history is, you have to teach the history of the Black radical tradition if you're also teaching the history of these systems of oppression. You have to do both. And not because they mirror each other, not because they're parallel, not because they're the same or a model or a blueprint, but they help us. It helps us to ask better questions about the moment that we're in and what we might do, and also because the history of Blackness is not one of just oppression and repression and death, right? It's constant resistance, and it's a life that emerges in the black hole that is this fucking country and capitalism. So anyways, I don't know where I'm going. Okay, I know where I'm going. That was a sidetrack. As an abolitionist, I think that police are a current manifestation, a very specific manifestation of anti-Blackness. But I am interested in abolishing anti-Blackness in all its form. And thus, in order to do that, I think we have to be asking hard questions about what is Blackness, right? And I think this word counterinsurgency, what it means to me is it immediately brings to mind this idea of Blackness as insurgents, right? And I think that's really important. And I think that, so what worries me about focusing on things like counterinsurgency, what worries me about focusing on some of the, like what we saw happening in like Seattle, and like the militarization of police and the is it's a focus on the excess, right, of violence, as opposed to what I first heard from Mariam Kaba and Tamara Napper, but I think they adopted it from Sadiya Hartman, the terrors of the mundane, right? And what are the terrors of the mundane of these systems of anti-Blackness? And that looks like, even just still focusing on policing, right? Stop and frisk, right? And that it's not just these spectacle moments of George Floyd, right? And that this ties back directly to slavery, where that you had sort of these spectacles of violence of slavery that inspired outrage, but that were used to try to encourage a sympathy. But again, that sympathy only went as deep as it was seen as there's excess. And so I think a lot about what is the mundane terror of policing? What is the mundane terror of anti-Blackness? And how do we challenge it, right? And without making appeals to sympathy and without making arguments of excess. So these are random things that I think about, and so beginnings to name some of my discomfort with this idea of counterinsurgency. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really interested to hear like what the next questions are. I'm not sure if these are just supposed to be my opening remarks, but yeah, my name is Paige. I organize young Black people here in Chicago. I'm originally from Vermont. And yeah, I'll leave it at that and see what else comes next.
Paige, that's fantastic. And I'm sure we'll have plenty of chances to be in conversation later on. So, and you said you're not a scholar, but you may not have gone to grad school, but you certainly are one. So very happy to have you here. Did I hear somebody want to speak as well before we jump to the next thing?
No, I just had to say Black Power after that because that was really dope.
Hell yeah. Awesome. Okay, we're going to go to Paul Passavant next. Paul, please.
Thanks, Charmaine. And first, I'd like to just say thank you to the organizers of Red May for putting together another fantastic month of events. And I'm also thrilled to be joining my co-panelists. The question I'm posing for myself today is, how has urban political economy stimulated post-democratic protest policing that responds to protests like the 2020 racial justice protests in a hybrid institutional mode somewhere between crime and war, counterinsurgency? During the 1950s and 1960s, cities lost manufacturing jobs and middle-class residents moved to the suburbs. This resulted in the urban fiscal crisis of the 1970s. The most prominent example of this was New York City. The Reagan and Bush presidencies cut federal funding for urban programs by about 2/3. States limited revenue raising by municipalities. So in response, cities reoriented infrastructures away from their residents to provide hospitable environments for the fire industries, finance, insurance, real estate on the one hand, and to appeal to visitors, tourists, and conventions on the other. They promoted fine dining, cultural events, theater, music, aquariums, museums, sports, and they hosted mega events. Events like major international summits, sporting events like the Super Bowl, and major party political conventions like the DNC and the RNC. And they did this to market themselves to potential visitors and conventions as new sources of revenue. From the perspective of the host city, the success of the mega event means preventing any disruption to this production of spectacle, be it crime, terrorism, a natural disaster, or protest. The most significant mega events are designated as National Special Security Events, NSSEs, the highest security classification under US law. For NSSEs, the Secret Service is the lead agency for security coordination. To prepare, police from the host city visit other cities hosting NSSEs to observe security arrangements, thereby spreading this policing knowledge and practice across an otherwise decentralized terrain of municipal and state police departments. The Department of Justice has planning and preparation materials to assist host cities in their security planning for such major events. These materials treat protests not as a First Amendment right necessary for democracy. They treat protests as threats to the equivalent, to the event equivalent to crime, terrorism, or a natural disaster. In other words, urban economic interests of the host city converge with security-oriented policing. The production of spectacle is deeply entangled with policing that is hostile towards protesters. New York City's bid to host the 2004 Republican National Convention was successful. The city wanted to host the RNC to demonstrate that it was back and open for business after the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Now, as part of its preparation to deal with protesters, the NYPD did 3 things that would later be deployed against Occupy Wall Street protesters and Black Lives Matter protesters. First, the NYPD sought to improve its intelligence capabilities regarding groups planning to protest at the RNC. Second, it developed mass arrest processing policies that would foreseeably extend the period of custody for arrested protesters. Although New York state law limits custody incident to an arrest to 24 hours, RNC protesters were kept in custody for 20, 30, 40, in several instances over 50 hours. So by arresting over 1,800 mass arrests during the RNC, and by holding them for lengthy periods of time, the NYPD sought to prevent disruption to the RNC. Although over 90% of arrestees had their charges dismissed or they were acquitted, the NYPD had already punished people for protesting with lengthy, degrading, and torturous detentions. Third, for the RNC, the NYPD acquired 2 LRADs, long-range acoustic devices. LRADs were developed initially for the US military. They are sonic weapons that can emit noises at dangerous levels too painful for humans to bear and which can cause permanent damage to those subjected to the noise. They can be used for announcements, and they have an area denial function, which achieves compliance through the infliction of unbearable pain. In 2004, the NYPD said it would only use its LRADs as glorified PA systems, for example, to direct people to safety in case of a calamity. What has been the legacy of the NYPD's 2004 RNC preparations and weapon acquisitions? The build-out of the NYPD's intelligence division was used against Occupy Wall Street activists in 2011 and 2012. We have learned from the compelled release of hundreds of Intel Division emails under New York State's Freedom of Information law actions that Intel was closely monitoring Black Lives Matter protests during the late fall and winter of 2014 through 2015. It was monitoring Black Lives Matter protests using undercover teams run by the NYPD's Organized Crime Control Bureau. The chief of Intel was in the loop. The only known deployments of the NYPD's LRADs have been at demonstrations. For example, an LRAD was present at the eviction of OWS in 2011. The first known use of the LRAD's alarm was against those protesting police brutality November 28, 2014, and its deployment against BLM became routine soon after. It was the night of December 4th, 2014 through the early morning hours of December 5th, 2014, when New York residents and people around the country protested a Staten Island grand jury's failure to indict NYPD officer Daniel Pantaleo for killing Eric Garner. Without warning, police began discharging pepper spray, causing demonstrators and observers to run in different directions. Seconds later, and without audible warning, the wail of a high-pitched alarm pulsed through the streets. The NYPD had activated the LRAD's area denial function. Officers interspersed orders not to interfere with traffic and the LRAD's alarm tones for approximately 3 minutes. Though people were fleeing, officers chased them while firing the LRAD, sometimes from fewer than 10 feet away. Protesters and journalists suffered physical injuries, including ear pain, prolonged migraines, vertigo, and ringing in the ears. One person suffered hearing loss and nerve damage due to the extreme level of sound, having pushed a bone in his ear inward. The sound bent the bone. Several are now afraid to attend protests. In sum, New York City's hosting of the 2004 RNC mega event left behind a security legacy. It left behind a build-out of intelligence division capacity for monitoring protesters, a now institutionalized mass arrest processing plan that utilizes mass arrest processing centers that punish people for exercising their First Amendment rights, by extending custody incident to an arrest, and it led to routinized use of LRADs against Black Lives Matter protesters. Must protest policing be hostile and violent towards protesters? No and yes. There are enough counterexamples historically in the US, or even during the summer of 2020, to prove policing is under no necessity to be violent towards protesters. But policing is part of the state. To the extent that state policies worsen economic inequalities, govern for markets rather than the needs of people, and choke off channels of political or economic power used by ordinary people, then to maintain this status quo against the people, the answer is yes. Policing has to be brutal to enforce brutal inequalities. This brutality was completely visible in the policing of the racial justice protests of 2020. It was the latest chapter of 40 years where policing has been retracted from the suites and has been intensified in the streets. To conclude, more equitably organized urban political economies are a step towards less brutal protest policing. But I also want to give a shout out to the Red May panel with Jody Dean and Sharice Burden-Stelly. The title of their book about Black communist women is Organize, Fight, Win. If we organize and fight for state policies to meet social needs, we can win some victories. How are we going to keep those victories and expand on them? I'm reminded of the slogan of armed white conservatives right after the Civil War, by ballot or bullet. Armed white conservatives overthrew municipal governments held by those committed to Reconstruction in Louisiana, South Carolina, and elsewhere by bullet and massacre. The lesson I take from the aftermath of the Civil War is that we may need to defend victories from right-wing violence so we can continue to organize and fight to meet social needs. So I will walk very far sharing the road with my comrades who advocate defunding the police to better meet long neglected social needs, and with those who advocate abolition. For too long, the US is governed through crime to the neglect of social well-being. But there will come a point where we may need to think seriously about the win part of organize, fight, win.
Thanks, Paul. That's fantastic. We're going to go to Stuart next, since I don't see that Sam's been able to join us. So Stuart Schrader, please.
Great, thanks so much. I'm really grateful to be here, a huge fan of Red May, and this is a really exciting panel, and I've already learned a lot. So in 2019, I published a book called Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. And in it, I showed that during the height of the Cold War, essentially from the 1950s to the 1970s, the United States engaged in counterinsurgency in over 50 countries by upgrading, modernizing, and reforming those countries' police forces. Counterinsurgency required, they thought, strong and capable police. I also argued that by looking at this overseas security assistance program, we could learn something fundamental about policing in the United States. We could learn that police reform and modernization within the United States, as well as the actual everyday and mundane operations of policing, to use Paige's terms, these actually amounted to counterinsurgency. In short, overseas counterinsurgency was policing, and at home policing was counterinsurgency. In some ways, the situation is unchanged today, but there are, of course, some significant differences. So I thought it might be useful just to explore a little bit more of this history and define some terms so that we can perhaps better analyze what's going on today. So let's start with the term counterinsurgency. Where did this term come from? In fact, historians don't really know for sure. Almost certainly it was coined around 1959 by a relatively obscure Army officer who was working with the CIA operative Edward Lansdale. You may have heard of Lansdale in part because he was nothing if not a self-promoter. And his self-promotion is part of the reason it's difficult to figure out who he was working with at the time, who was coming up with terminology. But the term caught on with the John F. Kennedy administration, which began in January of 1961. Kennedy and his brother used the term frequently, and the president himself was a big fan of Lansdale. The Kennedy administration created what it called the Special Group on Counterinsurgency, and that oversaw this police assistance operation to other countries. Of course, at the very same moment that the civil rights movement was gaining steam at home. Now, why did they need a new term? Counterinsurgency as a term did not name something new. Perhaps the most accurate analogous term at the time would have been pacification. But as Lansdale himself pointed out, that word sounded a bit French. Lansdale was worried that some national security officials were actually paying too much attention or listening too closely to what the French were saying about their experiences trying to prevent, independence in Algeria or Indochina. He wanted them to listen to him instead. But even outside the French experience, the United States did have experience with pacification. The United States even used that term. And its experience, of course, went back centuries. The problem, however, was twofold. Narrowly, the US Army was not very good at this time at learning lessons from its own past experience. And many of the individuals who had experience with what they would potentially have called pacification in the Caribbean or the Philippines, by the late 1950s, early 1960s, they were actually just too old to be still involved in the military, that most of them were retired. So the Army didn't learn its own lessons in some sense, or didn't study its own lessons. But the broader problem was more political. It was that the United States under Kennedy during the Cold War actually didn't want to be seen as a colonial power. Kennedy himself fashioned himself, as anti-colonial. France was a colonial power, of course. So the US did not want anyone to accuse it of replicating France, but of course that's what it actually did. The experience of the United States in places like the Philippines, where the United States could draw on its own experience waging counterinsurgency before that term existed, this was, of course, colonial. It was horribly racist. US national security officials under Kennedy were aware of this, and they did not want to feed propaganda victories to the communists, to Black radicals, so they pretended that that past history was in the distant past, in the rearview mirror. So they decided to come up with a new term. There was an argument about what it should be. One option was to use the term counter-guerrilla or counter-guerrilla warfare. And in practice, the United States did engage in counter-guerrilla warfare in a number of places. But this raised another question, which went to the heart of US geopolitical strategy at the time. Was the goal of fighting the Cold War merely containment, meaning not allowing the Soviet Union or later China and then Cuba to expand their influence and reach to other places? Or was the goal rollback, meaning defeating communist satellite regimes around the edges? If it were rollback, which a number of conservative voices and intelligence officials advocated, then the way to achieve rollback was actually to use guerrilla warfare. And arguably, Kennedy was on board with this plan until the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, which was supposed to roll back Castro's revolution via a kind of guerrilla attack. But after the Bay of Pigs disaster, national security officials largely discarded the offensive guerrilla warfare program, although it did continue in some other places. So what would replace it? Counterinsurgency designed to prevent revolutions. Counterinsurgency designed to contain the reach of the communist movement globally. And this is where policing becomes central to the picture. In countries where there were actual guerrillas operating, police and sometimes military were charged with neutralizing them, which meant capturing them, forcing them to defect, or of course, killing them. But what about the countries where there wasn't an active guerrilla movement? This is where a couple of other terms become important. One was counterintelligence. This was J. Edgar Hoover's preferred term for many FBI operations. Of course, you've heard of COINTELPRO. And the idea here was that enemy powers were using their intelligence agencies to gather information, spread disinformation, and mobilize subversives. Counterintelligence would repel this. The other term, which followed from this, was countersubversion. Countersubversion presumed that there were political operations occurring under the auspices and control of communist forces to discredit the government, take advantage of political discontent, and generally foster mayhem. The fears that the US had of subversion in other countries were massive. The worry was that subversion would lead to revolution. But of course, they defined subversion down. Writing graffiti, passing out leaflets, all of this could count as subversion. And of course, as people listening to this, people who are listening to this probably know, writing graffiti does not actually cause a revolution. You know, if spray painting ACAB abolished the police, my city, which is covered in ACAB graffiti, would not have police. So this raises a question. Who was the audience for these subversive appeals, according to the United States? In the schema of the period, the audience was, of course, the working class, factory workers, peasants, as well as students, though the worry was often that intellectuals themselves were subversives. And how did the subversives then gain adherence? Two ways. One, of course, was coercion, which brings us back to the counter-guerrilla idea. And the other was to take advantage of people's apathy or people's political dissatisfaction. If you're apathetic, you could be convinced to support the communists. And if you're dissatisfied, particularly due to poor economic conditions, then that might be even easier. So that resulted in economic development aspects of counterinsurgency. But remember, apathy is not going to be enough. Apathy won't suffice. The United States believed that people had to demonstrate loyalty, and this meant participating actively in economic development programs. Economic development programs were supposed to inoculate the population against those subversive propaganda appeals. And what happens if you don't want to participate in economic development? What if you don't want to participate by digging an irrigation ditch or helping to build a schoolhouse? Well, then the police are ready to intervene. And there was also a persistent argument that it would be impossible for developmental aid to be effective in the absence of security. So prior to the application of developmental aid, police, sometimes military, would clear the ground, often quite literally. Usually if the military got involved, it signaled that police had failed to do their job. And of course, this was true in the United States domestically throughout the 1960s as well. It's true today. Overall, what did other countries' police do in counterinsurgency on behalf of the United States? What they did was control protests, strikes, demonstrations, rallies. They gathered intelligence, funneled all the way from, hamlets in South Vietnam or villages in Guatemala, funneled all the way back to Washington. They prevented free movement of people across borders and searched for contraband ranging from weapons to, pamphlets or books. They focused their attention on regular people because regular people were the target of subversive appeals. And they disciplined anyone who did not demonstrate loyalty. But they also actively tried to ferret out and identify and then neutralize active political opposition. Because opposition was often difficult to locate, whether because it was underground or because everyone hated the regime, everybody's in opposition, the police then would engage in collective punishment. And of course, again, sometimes rely on the military to do so. Police used everyday methods of stop and search or stop and frisk. They used normal investigative routines. They used regular patrol, regular communications to achieve all of these tasks. And all of these fed into more extreme forms of violence, torture, violation of civil and human rights, and other types of abuses. So to sum up what I've said, counterinsurgency was designed to occur before an insurgency or revolutionary situation broke out. In part because once these situations did occur, they're virtually impossible to contain or control. Counterinsurgency relied on developmental aid and the political participation of the target population, which was meant to make subversion ineffective. And when counter-subversion failed, police were ready to enact security through coercive means. When there were guerrillas in the midst, they were neutralized. The combination of this preparatory counter-subversion through developmental aid and police following on in the footsteps, this is the essence of counterinsurgency. So just to close, I want to say a few things about the present based on what I've just said. I think there are a few strategic and political questions that I hope we can discuss about counterinsurgency today. First, we must ask, is there a sustained insurgency? Now, I've said that counterinsurgency is meant to come before the insurgency breaks out. But we're clearly in the United States in a very politically volatile situation. This is what Omedy was saying. And we're in a politically volatile situation globally. Is it a pre-revolutionary situation, to use a term that was used in the 1960s? I think the answer to that will be found in the streets. It's up to all of us to answer that question politically and actively. Second, does counterinsurgency need insurgency? No. This is why policing matters. Everyday policing, mundane policing enacts counterinsurgency because it treats the general population as potentially at risk of becoming insurgent. Third, are police today gathering intelligence? Absolutely. They're gathering so much intelligence they don't know what to do with it in general, but in specific cases and specific investigations, they have incredible resources at their disposal, especially federal law enforcement. Fourth, the private sector, is this a factor? Absolutely, and this meshes with intelligence gathering. Federal law enforcement is also buying data from private sources. This is different from the Cold War period. The private sector aspect is huge today, and I think really worth close scrutiny. Fifth, what about the military? I think the military has unlimited resources, basically, but I would actually say that US military operations within the United States are not my greatest worry. I would say they're my fourth greatest worry after federal law enforcement, local law enforcement, and right-wing neo-fascist organizations. So overall, I think the word counterinsurgency does still apply, although it depends what we mean by it. I think it still matters for our analysis, and that's why I'm very happy to have spoken with you today, and I look forward to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
This astonishingly rich assessment in 10 minutes, Stuart. Thank you so much. And last, we have, we're lucky to have us close Dr. Travis Harris. Travis, please go ahead.
Fuck 12. Fuck the police. I can't stand Popo. I'm tired of them. And if we can just get rid of them, all our lives will be better. I just wanted to open up with that. What's up, y'all? I go by a hood scholar, Dr. Travis Harris. I'm actually going to go by the script that was provided for us and just give y'all a little bit about my background. I'm going to try to do it in 30 seconds. Grew up in the hood, got my PhD. This is my first time speaking publicly. I was unjustly fired from Virginia Commonwealth University. I was unjustly removed from my class. Unjustly removed from my class and contract not renewed. And I just got results of the case like a couple of weeks ago, a month ago. So this is my first time speaking publicly. So that's where I'm coming from. I have zero, I didn't go crazy right now, but I'm gonna try to stay on topic. But so for me, right, that just solidified everything. So I am the Director of Revolutionary Education for the International Black Freedom Alliance, the IBFA. I was invited on this panel. Shout out to Sharice Burden Stanley. This is her second shout out today because she saw me active out in the streets. Because I know that we can't get free just reading books. We need to read books and we need to put it to work. And something that I always say is that everything is theoretical until we actually do it. So for me, I want to say this just to sum up the whole, the police is the strong arm of white supremacy. And the police upholds colonization, right? So when we think about the police, we call them Popo from out here. When we think about Popo, right? Of course, we all know it also goes back to slavery and pretty much the beginning of the paddy roller and slave patrols and all that, right? But the point for me, which is I think is important, that's going to contextualize all of my comments, which I'm kind of glad I'm going last because I'm going to think about how do we move forward, right? To contextualize all my comments is this. We're in a colony. I'm an African living on a strange diasporic foreign land, right? This ain't my home. This ain't where I'm from. My people, the design of Earth and universe wasn't meant for our people to be taken, right? This is the way life's supposed to be. You're not supposed to move an entire nation of people across an entire ocean, right? Never before has slavery ever existed. This is the first slavery where people were moved across the ocean, right? With the transatlantic slave trade, right? So this whole dehumanization, commodification process, you can really say change the landscape of history, but also change like who we are, who we are as African diasporic people. We are African diasporic people living on a colonized land, right? So we are living in a colony. And that's why I appreciate a lot of the comments that were made earlier, because we're focusing on the police. But like one of the questions asked for us to think about, what is the police connected to? And shout out to what Paige was saying, because Paige is like, look, I'm working with these middle schools. And then we at a point where they got police, they got popo in the school. Right, so the popo is everywhere. They're literally the strong arm of white supremacy. So when they pick apart our Black and brown kids from the school and say we're going to racially profile them, and if they act up, who they gonna get involved? The popo, right? And this is what Paige was getting us to think about, this terror of the mundane, because I literally, when I drive, like I've been put over probably, I start keeping count at 20 times. So every time I see red and blue lights behind me, I tense up. Right? It's just like, and I'm talking about just the color. It may not even be the police, but because I'm so used to them being behind me. Right? That's why I start off, fuck 12, right? While I was in grad school, I stepped out of my house. In front of my apartment, I am literally, and this is the crazy part, I'm dressed up in a suit because, you know, when I first started grad school, I thought I could like do the whole grad school thing and be all form, and I was going to the conference, whatever. I had on a suit. That didn't matter. I'm in front of my apartment, getting into my car, and a police officer stopped me and said, I look suspicious. Suspicious of what? In front of my fucking apartment. What am I suspicious of? In a two-piece suit. Right, this is what we're talking about, right? So yes, exactly what Stuart was saying, like, no, they can be counterinsurgents without us being insurgents. But I really am a surgeon, I really am about that life, right? So let me talk about being out in the streets and what I learned from that. One, the police have no conscience, right? And so we think about the police being the strong arm of white supremacy, upholding colonization, and us living on a colony. We can really think that white supremacy and those who are in charge, the institutions, the decision-making bodies, right? Like I can speak from my personal experience while I'm at VCU, and now even from the United States government, et cetera, they have no conscience. This is important because when we're thinking about actions and what we're going to do to move forward, we can't appeal. We can't make a moral plea to ask these people who are making decisions to change their actions. So I think for us, the question moving forward is this, right? If the police, if Popo is holding up the colony, and if they are the strong arm of white supremacy, what is it really going to take for us to get free, right? What is, as Paige stated, what is it going to take for us to be true abolitionists, right? How can we really free the plantation? And a shout out to this panel, because my concern was that we was going to talk about, okay, how can we have better conditions on the plantation? And my question is different. Instead of asking, how can we have better conditions on the plantation? My question is this: what would it take for us to get rid of the plantation altogether? That's the question we need to be thinking about, right? And I think, and we think about this from a colonial perspective and a colonized mindset, and how we need to dismantle white supremacy, then we are looking at the police's role in white supremacy and how we need to dismantle the entire global phenomenon that's attempting to pretty much colonize the world. That's the direction I believe that we should be going into. And I would close with this, right? So we think about the decolonial efforts from the past, I think, and we go from all throughout the continent of Africa, right? I think the biggest difference between the continent and where we are is that was those freedom fighters, those warriors, those decolonizers, they were fighting on their own land. So for us, the real question we think about here, in a colonized land, what does that fight look like, right? What does it look like to fight? And this is another thing, and I'm really thinking about what you said, Paige. We really need to be fighting and dreaming at the same time, right? Because we need a vision of freedom that does not perpetuate the very same practices that we're trying to get rid of. So what would it look like if we are if we are constantly being bombarded, the terror of the mundane, by the very everyday practices that is seeping in pretty much almost into our unconscious? How do we get to a point where we can envision freedom, envision a freedom that does not hold on to these colonial ideas? So for me, that's the major question for me, the major takeaway point, I think, just bringing all this together, right? Because as Stuart laid out, and as Paul laid out, this counterinsurgency, police, popo, whatever we want to call them, it has a very long history and a very intricate, wide force that, as we thinking about, even from the bombs being dropped in Palestine to basically us being shot when we out on the street in Ferguson and Minneapolis, to all of it being connected all over the world, right? From the security, the private, I think one of the questions on YouTube was like the private security forces that have been active since the 70s. That was connected to the anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa, which was connected to what was going on in the South, right? So if the beast that we're fighting is this expansive and this long, then for me, the question is complete dismantling of white supremacy and complete decolonization. And decolonization in every area of our life. And I will close with this. Some of the biggest lessons that I took away from being out in the streets, so some of it I cannot say, because this is black. Know the way white supremacy works. They can watch this and say, oh, they know that now, so then they're going to adopt to that. So some of that I cannot say. What I can say and close on a positive note is this. When I was out in the streets, I didn't see a lot of these intellectual and theoretical arguments that we be having, right? Like when you getting hit with tear gas, it didn't matter what you thought about Thoreau or Marx or any other thinker, right? You're trying to fight these bullets, either rubber or real ones, right? And so for me, I would close with this. My biggest takeaway is if we can focus on our real enemy, which is white supremacy and counterinsurgency and colonialism, instead of all these theoretical bickering, backfighting, just imagine how much further we can be along in the freedom process. So y'all, that's it. Clear Scholar, let's get free.
Powerful words to end. Thank you so much, Travis. Let's get free. So I am going to open, I think, with a couple of questions. I have more than 4, but I'm going to try to limit my questions and use them as a way to maybe bridge some of these conversations. And then if anybody who's watching on the YouTube channel has questions, please put them in the chat. And if we don't get a lot of questions from the audience, then maybe what we'll do is open up and see if y'all have questions for each other. So as we're talking, you might want to think about questions that you have for your fellow panelists. So I want to try to think about the really powerful way in which all of you have tried to help us think about the longer histories in which counterinsurgency takes place, about the forms of the terror of the mundane that undergird practices of policing, about the ways in which even urban economic interest and accumulation strategies are embedded into the spectacular violence that policing takes, about Omedy's point that, fighting policing also requires taking stock of other material forms like wageless life. And I guess I guess maybe my question is this: counterinsurgency takes on both mundane forms and spectacular forms. And when you're fighting police on the street, when you're being shot with tear gas and rubber bullets, there is, I think, a moment where the force in the street and the fight in the street exposes the violence of the police and effectively calls to attention the way that the state wages violence against Black bodies and bodies who are in opposition to the state's monopoly of violence. But then COIN can also take on, as Paige and Stuart both pointed out, these really mundane forms, right, where counterinsurgency doesn't need insurgency as much. And I was thinking a lot about the ways in which, you know, when the Portland protests were happening, when the burning of the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis were happening, a lot of the media attention was on these violent and spectacular moments. And then once the sort of like direct confrontation recedes and cities go back into modes of mutual aid, which was a lot of what was happening in Minneapolis, where my roots are and that I was a part of last year, right? Like people were starting to do the forms of insurgency that I think Paige is referring to that are abolitionist in their spirit, feeding people, buying Pampers, providing food, doing the abolitionist work of educating or building our capacities for imagining worlds without police. And so I suppose I want to maybe ask, if we are to take both the kind of mundane and spectacular ways that counterinsurgency takes place, and if we're also to take stock of the way that insurgency also has these spectacular and mundane forms, how do we build a kind of abolitionist movement that can adequately recognize the importance of both of these, where we're not like fetishizing the spectacular on the one hand, but we're also paying attention to those mundane forms of organizing that are required in the kinds of lulls and periods where direct confrontation isn't happening? I hope that question is clear, and anyone's happy to pick it up.
Yeah, I'll jump in first with saying that, like, I do gotta say this. Paige, Omedy, and I perspective from the police is gonna be completely different from Paul, Stuart's, Phillips, and yours, Charmaine. So like, I know that when we think about like, so for me, I would make those, I think that DMARC explained is clearer to you than it would be to me. So I can't speak for Omedy and Paige, but like for me, Popo is Popo, right? So I wouldn't say like there's like the news made it spectacular, but we know about Black people who are being killed by the police on a regular basis. So unfortunately, like I can't believe I'm even verbalizing, but like that's almost normalized. So it's almost as if that which is spectacular to the world is mundane to us. So I just want to say that. So I think it's going to be the position.
I can say, I mean, I think that like at the heart of this is just a question of how do we organize? Like, how do you organize and win like that? And like, that's, and again, this word abolition is important because it has historical roots back to slavery, where like clearly that was effective organizing. It was like incredible. Like I cannot fathom, right, the courage and the brilliance of what it took to abolish slavery in that form. But also we've inherited this unfinished struggle, right? And that is why I think abolition, it speaks to that larger thing. And as an like I organize like in a place, like I believe in organizing your neighbors and place-based organizing. And there's, again, this is why when you are teaching about how fucked up cops are, you also have to teach about the Black radical tradition, because the history of policing is a history of anti-Blackness, and you cannot teach that well without also showing the resiliency and the revolution inherent to Blackness. And so, I mean, I think, and if you look at that, I mean, throughout history, effective organizing, and I've studied the Black radical tradition, that's what I can speak to, and I think it is sort of used by a lot of other people as a foundational canon to study. I don't know the word. Anyways, if people lift up the Black radical tradition, don't always give it credit. But that there's always this tension of how do you polarize people? That it's yes, you have a target and you focus on your target and getting them to change, but you do that by effectively polarizing the public and shrinking the amount of people who are neutral. You don't really change people who are opposed to you, but you get people out of the middle and you force them to actively show their support and to pick a side. And this is why chants right now in the street, you'll hear chant like, which side are you on, my people? Which side? That's old. That's fucking an old ass chant that people have been saying, which side are you on, for a really long time, right? It used to be like, which side are you on, friends? Which side are you on? And the creation, the storytelling through organizing of a freedom side. And that you can use these moments of spectacle to pull in more people, but that's only effective if you have containers. And so what we need is what we need is more people building containers. And I believe specifically in building place-based containers as opposed to just people who think like you, right? People who are already down, right? But actually building with neighbors. And I believe in studying and practicing the principles of restorative justice, which people sort of have co-opted or like minimized to just mean circles, conflict circles, especially when we're talking about like cops in schools, get rid of cops in schools. That means let's just force students to do peace circles when there's conflict. And that's not restorative justice. Restorative justice is a way of approaching relationship building, a way of approaching community building, a way of approaching trust. And that framing I've learned from someone named Corey Allen from a Brooklyn org called Paula. So anyways, I think that this question is about how do you organize? And what happened in Minneapolis and what happened in Portland didn't come out of nowhere. It is because people have been building containers and building a movement for not even before 2014, right? And I know here in Chicago, I got pulled in because of the murder of Dominique Franklin. People don't know his name, but for me, like that was my pull-in. He was friends of my friends. He was murdered by CPD. We started getting organized. He was killed in May of 2014. In August of that year, Mike Brown is killed, and we had this thing. People were angry. People wanted to do something, and we were like, well, here in Chicago, we got weak charge genocide. So folks threw down, and we had 5-year-olds donating their allowance to us. We had grandmamas donating their social security checks. My hometown in Vermont donated more money than anywhere else, like as a single org than anything else. And then you had hundreds of people showing up and making this effort called We Charge happen. And all of this is because a community came together on the people who love Damo and said, what do we do? What do we do in this moment where Damo's dead and there's no bringing him back? There is no justice. Like, he's gone and he shouldn't be. And I think doing that work also in the mundane, when it's not sexy, when there aren't cameras everywhere, that is how you make the most of those moments as well. And if you only study these moments of the whirlwind, you miss the foundation that makes the whirlwind actually do something important. But I highly recommend for folks, I've Got the Light of Freedom by Charles Payne. If you only read part of it, read chapter 8. It's just a brilliant outline of civil rights organizing. And a lot of it had to do with, okay, I'll say the last thing. My favorite quote from it is they asked, Bob Moses, how do you organize a town? And he said, you get a ball. And they were like, what? So you get a ball and you bounce it. And then the kids are going to come out and play with it. And then he says, and then eventually that ball is going to roll under somebody's front porch and then you'll meet the parents. And that's how you organize. Yeah.
I'd like to jump in or jump off of that a little bit. I like to think about policing as it's a window onto the state. And, it's part of the state. And the carceral state today, it disintegrates society in different ways, whether we're talking about incarceration or the kinds of intelligence gathering and surveillance that's done that Stuart talked about. And I just want to give a shout out to Free the People Rochester for their struggle in terms of defunding the police. They are always tying that to better meeting social needs. And so, on the one hand, out there in the streets, confronting the Rochester police over Daniel Prude, but on the other hand, constantly fighting the battle. No, we don't need another precinct house for them. We need healthcare, we need education, we need housing, we need jobs, we need fair wages, we need to fight poverty, we need childcare, we need to enrich the lives of children. And the way that they weave that in about meeting social needs, and building something better, to fight the disintegrative forces of the carceral state. I just think the work they're doing has been great. And they're always like, you know, obviously that's a huge job. And so they're like, look, we're in it for the long haul. You know, don't blow your heat right now. We're in it for the long haul. And so strap in and get ready.
Amazing. Thank you all. I'm learning so much. This is a fantastic conversation.
Hey, Charmaine, can I jump in as if by magic? I was just inspired by what I'm hearing everybody say. Excuse me for running in. But, you know, the way everything fits together from the various perspectives we're thinking of. Think of when Paul was talking about that image of the town which is developing its way of protest policing. It's a new city that has evolved around convention centers, big sporting events, perhaps cruise ships coming in. In other words, it's a city that's designed to create revenue, but not to provide anything that 90% of the inhabitants need. Their inhabitants are concerned about, will the libraries be open later? Are there more parks over here? Those sort of things. But the downtown association that's developing a town is kind of trying to maximize revenue and capital circulation through these devices that are supposedly going to invigorate an inner city. And that means that essentially you're going to have a large number of people whose needs aren't even attended to and dealt to. And how do you deal with people who the needs are not provided for? You assume that you start to look at them as potential insurgents, right? You have people who come and join the police force who are coming back from Afghanistan or somewhere where they've developed an eye where they look at people who are just hanging around or loitering as potential insurgents who are going to attack you. So you bring that eye back to the town, which is becoming something that is not serving the majority of its inhabitants anyway. So you've now got to develop new rules about how they can gather, where they can go, and so forth. So you have this kind of chain reaction that's going, where one thing is playing into the other. So it seems to me that the visions that you're talking about kind of mesh and interact very, very easily in terms of how urban America is developing. I don't know what you think, you know, Stuart or Paul, since I'm kind of riffing off of your urban framework there.
No, I think you're absolutely right. But you know, it sounds like you're describing Seattle, honestly. But I don't know if Stuart's got some ideas more specifically about how people circulate, say, from Afghanistan or Iraq, and then come back and wind up viewing urban populations in a manner similar to what they've been trained to do. You know, fighting counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Colombia or someplace.
Well, I don't actually have anything in particular to say about that. I just wanted to go back to Charmaine's, or well, basically the previous conversation that we were having, and just point out that, you know, for a lot of police leaders and reformers, they would love to avoid the spectacular incidents because they believe, you know, I think in line with what everybody's been saying, you know, they believe that these are organizing tools, and these for you know, radicals and militants, they know that people get mad when a spectacular incident happens, and it, you know, invigorates them politically. So police actually, you know, not all police officers, but police, you know, chiefs and the people who kind of develop the latest police scientific, you know, ideas. They are always trying to come up with ways to prevent these incidents. The problem that we all, I think, are pointing to is the impossibility of avoiding those incidents, right? But they will never let go of the dream that they can get rid of them, precisely because they think it will be a way to demobilize and prevent political mobilization. They're wrong, but this is the way that they think.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm going to go to some audience questions now. Omedy, there was a question specifically for you, but I think that might be folded into a broader question. Somebody asked if you would speak a little bit from the Africanist perspective about how policing lands or might look different from an Africanist perspective. And perhaps the question that I would expand that towards and ask the rest of you, and perhaps Stuart, given the kind of global reach of your research in the way that you saw counterinsurgency as policing abroad and then policing as counterinsurgency locally, what does a global abolitionist vision require or look like? Can abolition be sort of transported out of the specificities of its roots in the Black radical tradition in the US and help us think about the ways in which policing operates in different kinds of locales? And I know that that's a really large question, so please take it in whatever way you'd like. But perhaps, Omedy, we could start with you.
Yeah, excellent question. One that I'm almost afraid of answering because it feels like a part of a bigger project I'm working on. But here's what I would say, that, yeah, one of my points is certainly that we really have to start thinking in a planetary way. So that means that we really internalize the idea of the US as an empire, not simply a country, but as an empire. And that will involve also then attending to spaces outside the US, such as in Africa, for instance, where there is intense resistance against the police. We know about, for instance, in Nigeria, the End SARS uprising that went against sort of this police unit that was responsible for theft, for kidnapping, for torture, and so on. We know about how in Kenya, I think Kenya has some of the highest rates of police killings, especially the killing of poor people. In everywhere in the continent, I think Kenya stands up there statistically as one of the most brutal policing places. In South Africa as well. And that then brings me to a second point about this, that we have to attend to how a lot of the uprisings are over the mundane issues, such as, for instance, in Nigeria, for how the government tried to pull back subsidies for fuel. Or in Sudan, the Sudan uprising also was around those sort of bread and butter issues. And therefore that, yes, in a sense, there's this spectacular policing violence, but also that the police are there to protect property, to safeguard property, and to uphold a certain capitalist order. And that we have to attend to those sort of social questions. And maybe the last point I would say is that we can learn a lot from some of the uprisings in the African continent. So one of the things I mentioned, for instance, in the piece I asked others to read was that notion of ungovernability, which at least in the South African context involved massive rebellion in all contexts against the government during the apartheid regime. And I wonder then about those ideas of ungovernability sort of articulate across the world, including the United States. And for me, ungovernability sort of articulates at least two aspects. One is how people experiment with forms of living in spaces that are abandoned, spaces of neglect and abandonment. So for instance, we can think about, for instance, in Texas, when there was this massive power outage, the government just wasn't there. And so people had to come together to cobble together forms of living. And the second, of course, in ungovernment is direct attacks, right? Looting, vandalism, sabotage, street fighting. But those two are closely connected, right? They're forms of just cobbling together a form of living, which people sort of come together to live together, because in those places the government has disappeared. And secondly, more like direct attacks against not only the state, but against all these economic firms and multinationals that are oppressive. Thank you for that question.
Super. Anybody else want to jump in? No. Stuart's like, this is too hard. It's too big. It's probably not too hard. Okay, that's great because we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in from the chat. So I'm going to go to them now. We have a question about private security forces, which I think some of you have already a little bit acknowledged. So the question is, I'm interested to hear what role the speakers think private security forces will play. For instance, the citizen security force in development right now. Does anybody want to speak to that? I think I might also add that, you know, one of the things that we've been witnessing across a number of cities is that as defund movements have sought to push the police out of various kinds of places, like, for example, out of Minneapolis public schools, they have hired private security forces in replacement of the police, right? So how do we think about the ways in which privatized security is somehow now becoming a solution to, you know, abolitionist efforts that didn't want it to be replaced by other kinds of privatized police?
I guess I would just maybe say one quick thing, which is that I think this points to the necessity of not, even as I make my living studying the police, like we make a mistake if we focus too much on the police. We need to think about policing as a kind of activity, you know, like what Paul was talking about, like, as you know, it's part of the state. We can also extend it to thinking about capital, thinking about broader power structures as well. You know, and if we focus only on the institution, I think we sometimes miss some other things that are going on, particularly in the realm of privatization and so forth, or private forces. And we need to recognize that other forces besides just, you know, uniformed police officers can engage in policing, even if they are not police. And I think that kind of analytic shift could be really useful and help us to avoid exactly what you point to, Charmaine, insofar as, you know, when we talk about getting rid of the police, you know, we're not, it's not just like a strictly budgetary question or fiscal question. Even though defund the police is an extremely powerful demand, it's about completely changing our social relations and changing our institutions and changing our cities and changing our world, you know, and we can't just only narrowly focus on a particular bureaucracy.
Actually, that question speaks to, and I could not agree more with what Stuart has said and what Charmaine's pointing out, that I think we have to have a broader sort of notion of what policing is. And that question really speaks to one of my critiques of community control of the police, that insofar as they still insist on a certain notion of policing, it doesn't go far enough in thinking about radically abolishing policing. And that's why then I want us to be attentive to this economic decline, this capitalist decline, the sort of continued secular stagnation in capitalism, insofar as some ideas, I think, sometimes evoke these ideas of that still sort of conceive of a time when the state had this will continue to sort of fund things and had this power. And I see the future as one in which we're going to have particular spaces that are heavily policed, and lots of spaces where the state pulls out, the state abandons cities and abandons neighborhoods. And then what happens then? I think that calls for ways of practices of living that I'm calling ungovernability.
Does anybody else want to jump in on this question about privatization of security forces?
I'll just jump in real quick to mention the way in which the privatization of security forces in some ways really expands the repressive aspects of the state. Like, for example, Stuart was mentioning the way that police purchase data from private companies. And so that's one of the ways, not like that police can actually get around things like Fourth Amendment limits on searches and seizures, because the folks who are gathering the data are actually the commercial data brokers or, Palantir, whoever it is that we're talking about. And so it actually can be a way that they can evade some of the minimal controls that are on them. So it's a really important question.
I will very briefly just say my experience of private police is universities. And I could spend 10 minutes just shit talking the University of Chicago and the ways that it has done for over 100 years, had a massive campaign to take back, they never had it, but to take over the Black Belt of Chicago. And I live in the old heart of it now. And the first thing they send out after they buy all the empty property and the empty buildings is their private police. And it used to be the largest private police force in the country. I don't believe it still is anymore, but it's the University of Chicago Police Department. And I think that this is where people that are affiliated with universities really need to be making connections between those institutions and police. And just again, but also pushing past this idea of like, we'll be free once we get rid of the thing we call police, because they will happily call it something else. Like that is just a word, right? And those are just buildings and those are just technologies. It's the thing that we're trying to abolish is much more complex. And the earlier question of like, no, you cannot do abolition without Black people. Like, absolutely not. And by Black people, I mean the diaspora, but I mean particularly Blackness as understood as like a slave or a slave in waiting. And that those people have to be at the center of abolition. And it is a decolonial movement, and that is complicated. That has an added layer of complexion or complication in places like the US where we're not indigenous to here, but we also can't really go back to that part of Blackness is natal alienation. You don't have motherland in the ways that other indigenous peoples do. So I've now talked a lot, but yeah, so private policing, it's got to go, but you all have to center Black people in a global movement for abolition.
It's really powerful, Paige. And I'm just going to point out that Chandra Kumanika in the chat also pointed out that it's not just the state that's sort of finding ways to hire private police forces in different ways. It's also that Amazon hires Pinkertons and similar forces to suppress labor organizing in Spain and Poland, and actually in the Bessemer fight as well. And he also pointed out, or they also pointed out, that UPenn is one of the largest private policing forces. And I think the largest is actually Yale. So this is a good opportunity perhaps to drop in the YouTube chat, copsoffcampuscoalition.com, a coalition that's organizing to get cops off campus across Turtle Island, both in the US and Canada. If anybody here is listening in and is part of an institution, please join us and join our fight. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the Q&A. There's a question here that I think might pick up quite nicely from some of these conversations. So Jody Dean asks, is it necessary to imagine a coercive force that defends against white supremacy, colonizers, and capitalist exploiters? In other words, is it necessary to acknowledge a force counter to the police that is like our counter police? If not, why not?
Can you just read that one more time, please, Charmaine?
Sure. So the question is it necessary to imagine a coercive force that defends against white supremacy, colonizers, and capitalist exploiters? In other words, is it necessary to acknowledge a force that's counter to the police that is like our counter police? If not, why not? So John Brown Gun Club, the Minnesota Freedom Fighters, people who've taken on coercive dimensions to counter policing as a force to respond to the violence of the state or the violence of private security.
I don't know. I just try to be ungovernable. That's all. That's the most I can imagine.
It seems like the answer is yes. If we think about the violence that was used in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War by white supremacists to take over governments, literally to overthrow them and to terrorize people. And we saw that January 6th when, armed mobs were literally willing to try to, they invaded the Capitol. And so we do need our counter police, and that's part of building our counter power, I think.
This is
I
a really
think
hard
this
question.
kind of brings up one. I was trying to make sense of the question, and I think I understand basically them asking, should we have like our own military, maybe, or our own police force in a sense, but not so much to police ourselves, but to defend ourselves against the police. And that, if I understand the question that way, then this will circle back to a point that I was making, where we're thinking about our decolonizing efforts and how the battle that we have here is much different than the battle we have on the continent, right? So we are literally living in enemy territory. So if we are in enemy territory, so on the continent, right, you can literally we can outnumber the British, the French, etc. They're sending people over to Africa, but here, like, these are, like, unfortunately, like, I grew up in the hood, but unfortunately I live in the burbs now. I got pulled over in front of my house. So it's like, they're my neighbors, right? My enemy is my neighbor. So I think this is a very difficult question, because I think I'm 100%, I 100% believe that we need to be strapped up, right? We need to have the scopes, we need to have the beams. It's a necessary part of the movement. The question is, to what extent can we use it? And then also, since we are on enemy land, and they literally call what's his fourth concern, and they literally call in the National Guard or the Army. I mean, even if it's only like 40 million Black people, right? So they can literally, I'm concerned that we can't win a gunfight here. So this is a struggle. We can't win a gunfight against the Marines, the U.S. Army, the special forces, we can't win a gunfight here. But at the same time, we do need to be able to have self-defense. So that's why I like Malcolm X was the man. I'm gonna mention this classic book. I'm thinking everybody might have heard of it, but if you haven't, it's a book written by Robert Williams. It's called Negro with Guns. If you have not read that book, check that book out. He resisted in North Carolina, strapped up. He was able to protect his family. And then also a good movie is A Spook Who Sat by the Door. So if you haven't seen that, that's a good one. That's actually free on YouTube. But yes, so yes, we do need guns, right? We do need to be strapped, but we can't win a gunfight in enemy territory. So that's what we got to figure out. So right now, like I said, it's all theoretical and this is the thing, right? And this is why we got to be careful, right? Figuring this out is automatic bodies, right? Like, people automatically going to die while we go through this process. So I think that's the best approach to that question of having our counter force. We do need to be able to protect ourselves, but we also own enemy territory.
Thank you, Travis. Also, lots of good recommendations being put out here. So if people want to type them into the YouTube chat so that folks have those in writing, that would be cool too. I have one last question from the Q&A, and maybe I'll close with another, and then we might just perhaps close it after that, unless any of you have burning questions for each other. So the last Q&A from the audience is, a question I have is sort of going off the LRAD part of this talk, by which I think they mean long-range acoustic devices, and perhaps in reference to Stuart's part of the talk talking about surveillance. So how do we build a movement that knows the ins and outs of these technological advances in order to overcome them? And I'll read that again. How do we build a movement that knows the ins and outs of these technological advances in order to overcome them?
So y'all, I want to just jump off on this one. I'm fortunate in my organization to be building with some former Black Panthers. And so I know this might sound crazy, but the best answer to this question is actually an intergenerational movement. So let me explain. I've been organizing in coalition building with some former Black Panthers and people who were active in the movement in the 60s and the 70s. I remember at one of our conferences, they were just like, don't look up. That just seems like a normal thing, right? Well, the reason why they were saying that was because if you look up, then the cameras from the sky can then see your face. It's like, oh. So think about this, right? When they was moving, during the 60s and 70s, think about what they were able to accomplish. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have phones. They didn't have social media. They didn't have like all of the technological advancements we have now, right? But they were able basically to quote unquote shoot, move, and communicate. So I think, and now I know that an intergenerational movement where we are able to apply, and I'm kind of afraid to say some of this out loud because I don't want the enemy to notice, but if we are able to apply some of the techniques that they were able to use in the 60s and 70s that are not confounded by the technological tools that we use now, then that will actually counter the surveillance. Another important thing to note, again, I learned this from, I was planning this protest during this halftime, and I was organizing a Facebook group. Some kind of way, and this was a private Facebook group, it wasn't a public one, but some kind of way, the halftime that we was gonna do our demonstration or whatever, they found out about it. So I just want to share that to say that pretty much any type of communication online is being tracked some kind of way. I don't know who leaked out. It might have been somebody in the group, or it could have just been Facebook. I don't know. After I had that experience, I'm like, whatever and this is why it's so hard because Paige, you work with kids too. That's why it's so hard for the younger generation to realize that anything that's put on Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or whatever it is, like, it's being tracked, right? And it's going to be spread, and somebody going to pick up on it. So we need to implement these use the question LRAD, but basically these non-communicative ways that are easily tracked. And that's why I also be careful what I'm even saying on this call, because it's out there now and somebody can hear it. So yes, intergenerational organizing can be an effective organizing strategy.
Such a great answer. And somebody in the chat said that too. This answer rocks. Thank you, Travis. Anybody else want to jump in here?
I guess this is just a plug for good old-fashioned organizing, like the kind that Travis and Paige do, where like a student of mine did a paper on on contemporary ways that social media stuff gets surveilled from protesters, and so it's like police can respond in real time using geofencing technologies and so forth to respond in real time to protests. And so this is just a plug for good old fashioned get people together and don't do it over Facebook or Twitter, and have a conversation and plan your actions.
Oh my God, can you imagine that? Gathering in basements together again? I have
a question for Omedy, something that he said at the beginning that no one picked up on, but I think is worth some reflection. You talked about the police being outside the juridical order. which is a fancy way of saying that they don't obey the law. They choose whether or not to obey the law in every way. And it's not just in breaking the law in the spectacular crimes that we witness on iPhone. It's that, for example, when the Justice Department had a consent decree against the Seattle police, where it just ordered them to do certain things. They basically found ways not to do any of it. And the ways of not obeying the law are as creative as tax attorneys, the options that tax attorneys give to businessmen. It's and so this is a larger question. I think we're not dealing just with the police who are outside the juridical order, but they're essentially above a certain level. People do not obey the law in America, and I don't think that's something that the left has done as good a job as possible in making known, that that law breaking is unanimous, is ubiquitous among the rich, and it's also ubiquitous among certain levels of military, as we saw at Abu Ghraib and afterwards. How can we? Is this something that we can leverage? This kind of both against the police and against other lawbreakers, or is it something that for some reason it doesn't speak to what people care about? Is it too wonky to say, too constitutional law professory to say, well, they're breaking, they don't obey the law in any way at all?
Thanks for picking up on that. I've been thinking about this also, and maybe there's another way of thinking about it, which is how the police make the law, insofar as maybe this is a sort of point that is articulated in Benjamin's, essay about how, when the police turn on you and beat you up, they sort of criminalize you. So they sort of they decide who is a criminal and who is not a criminal. They sort of, there's this performative aspect when the police say you are a criminal, then you are a criminal, which then ought to make us then think about the whole idea of criminality. Sometimes there has been sort of an unfortunate distinction that some people try to make between criminal activity and political activity. But insofar as the police then conceive of any sort of vast bodies, I think this is something that Travis mentions, and that there's a certain sense in which blackness is criminal just by virtue of being Black, and I would say indigenous peoples and Latinos peoples and so on. So there are sort of a lot of implications I think about when I'm thinking about that idea of how the police sort of construct criminality. For instance, right now there's an unfortunate discourse about how rising crime is going up, and for me, when I hear such notions of how rising that crime is going up, I think about that we need to think about how that's a construction of the police.
Right, and they've also sold the idea of order as the central virtue that is always threatened, lawlessness. I mean, not just the police, but political figures. And I mean, that's obviously going to, the reaction to the January 6th attempted coup is going to be to fight some laws which are against general disorder, which are going to end up being applied mostly to the next wave of protests, the next George Floyd rebellion. So they're not going to fall on the heads of the people who inspired them. And that's a kind of infuriating situation, but that's what we face.
Well, I actually got a question for you, Phil and Stuart. Because my question is, when we think about this framing of the left and the right, in many ways, like you mentioned June 6th, you can say that the right has been quote unquote more radical than the left has been, and that they're just like basically Forget the whole commandments. I mean, the whole Constitution. Forget democracy. Forget all of that. We're gonna do whatever we want to get what we want, right? And I mean, I ain't gonna lie. I was kind of like, I was trying to defend Obama as long as I could, but after I saw what Donald Trump was doing, I was like, Obama, why you didn't do this stuff? Like, we can hate Donald Trump all we want, but Donald Trump was taking up for the right. He was hustling his red hats. He was emboldening all those white racists to go out there and fight people and do all that crazy stuff, right? So my question is like, can we have another John? We have the left to stand up and take that type of action and power and might, because that's what it seemed like. That's at least one thing that the institution that is governing the state.
It's not a liberal that's going to do it, unfortunately. The general policy of liberals for the last 10 or 12 years has been to punch left and reach across the aisle to the right. As the right, as you say, is breaking every law and moving as extremely as it can. You know, all the liberals do is get in the way of people who are further on the left who want to respond to those blows, you know, with something more than imploring them to obey the law or remember the Constitution, or we're all one country, we're not a red and blue states, but we're this and that, you know. And then I think the problem has been that essentially the liberal center has been, has just more or less done nothing, but it's worried more about the left than the right. That's the problem. My opinion.
Stuart, did you want to pick this up too? No. Okay. I'm going to finish with maybe just an open question, and hopefully that one that all of you are willing to answer and respond to. And I'll just also point to the fact that there's a wonderful set of comments in the chat. So for those of you who are able to read and look that up afterwards, it's been a wonderful conversation. I really wish these people could actually be in a room with us. So I guess my closing question is, we've talked variously about sustained insurgency, about ungovernability, about old-fashioned organizing, and Paul at the end of his talk asked, what does it mean to say organize, fight, win, and asked the question of what it means to actually win. And so perhaps just an open question to all of you is, in your organizing, in your scholarship, in your work, what is one of the main things that you've been thinking about recently that helps you think about what insurgency means or what ungovernability means to you in your work? How do you pick up that concept in your daily work or your daily organizing?
I'll go quickly. Something that I don't think we've talked about at all is right, when we're talking about capitalism, when we're talking about colonization, when we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about very, very rigid gender binaries, and that there is no abolition that isn't feminist as well, and that is building a world where difference can exist, and it not mean that it can anticipate greater violence to happen to you based off of difference, and that we're not trying to abolish difference, right? That we're not trying to say there is no difference. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that this is the importance of having feminist praxis, and that's something that we can do that we need more people doing in their daily lives. And a lot of the daily work that I do as an organizer and as a teacher is challenging toxic masculinity, and making those connections. It's called the fraternal order of the police, and so I think that's something that again, we could have spent the whole time just talking about gender, so I don't feel like I'm doing it any justice right now, but this feels like a window to name that gap, or that silence that was here. And again, going back to the history, the civil rights movement grows out of resistance in response to sexual violence against Black women in the South, and in defense of Black women's dignity. That's how you get MLK in Montgomery. Anyways, because of the long work of folks like Rosa Parks before she ever got famous. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's a big part of what this looks like, is lifting up feminist work that's happening, and figuring out how to incorporate that even if you don't identify as woman or femme. And again, within that as well is just the police, the first prisons in this country locked up Indigenous people and fed them to dogs. And specifically, it was Indigenous people who were seen as outside of the gender binary. And that policing has always been transphobic. And that all of those things are a part of what we have to be working on right now.
Thank you, Paige. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Well, I'll just go ahead and go with King. I studied King a lot. My homie is like, my homie doesn't like, well, he likes King's organizing ability, but we always have a lot of conversations about King and X, and not even the theoretical stuff, but like the actual, like King's ability to organize people, right? Which that can't be taken away from him. But I'll close, I'll make these final remarks. King finally, right? He got to the point where he said, oh man, like I integrated my people into a burning house, right? And then I believe in 67, I think it's the speech, where do we go from here? He makes this statement that I constantly think about. America must be born again. This is a powerful statement because, of course, he's coming out of that Southern Black Baptist Christian tradition where he's talking about, where he uses this terminology of being born again, right? But the term is not in the strictly theological sense or the response to repentance of God, but more so when we think about, and I believe King had got to this point because, eventually, and y'all should love this, right? What happens? He starts to organize the Poor People's Campaign, right? He's starting to recognize the value and significance of mobilizing all these poor people together. And then, of course, you speak out against Vietnam. I mean, we don't like this king, we got to kill him. But what is he saying with this statement? He's saying that the very fabric of what it is that we are calling America needs to be completely wiped away. And then if we use the Christian terminology, not specifically this, but imagine a new heaven, right? A new heaven and new earth. Not so much, because even just like Paige was doing the connection back to the South, when the slaves was talking about, I got shoes, you got shoes, all my children got shoes, when I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my shoes. They weren't talking about heaven specifically, but they were talking about freeing the South and going up to Canada, right? That was happening. So when we think about this new heaven, this new earth, this new place, then when I think about a win, will be a radical reimagining that's fully manifested in a completely, in a sense, a brand new world. I know these are lofty and great ideas, right? But I think that that's what freedom looks like, right? Where that we don't have neither the mundane or the spectacular. It's not just, I don't have to deal with the psychological and existential term or the physical harm or the material harm, but a completely brand new world. And until we get to that point, I'm not sure we will ever be able to get free.
Paige, Travis, you are a tough act to follow. But Stuart, Paul, Omedy, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure I can add anything to beautiful and true and insightful engagements like as Paige and Travis have made. So yes, yeah, I would just say in response to that question that I do see these forms of care work, of this sort of struggles around reproduction as just as vital and even more vital. And that means then attending to, for instance, Black feminist practice of how people live together and how people work often against the state, often outside the state, to articulate forms of living that are antinomian, that are ungovernable.
I'll just mention again that policing's part of the state. And so to the extent that this state has been actively producing forms of social and economic inequality, policing is deeply embedded in those state practices. And to the extent that we try to build ourselves an economy and a politics that better meets social needs, that meets the needs of social reproduction. Omedy mentioned ecological devastation, without addressing things like, by addressing things like climate change, then we will have a better society that will not be involving the kinds of repressive and destructive policing that we see today.
I guess I just want to say that, since last summer, the conversations generally that are happening around this stuff have been remarkable, and I'm actually like incredibly hopeful, and I remain inspired. I don't feel like a year out from the 2020 uprisings that that we've lost steam or lost the fight or anything like that. I think that actually we're continuing to build and we're continuing to change the world, and I think we should hold on to that, and obviously not every day is going to feel like a victory or a success, but we're in an incredible upswing. I think we're still in an incredible upswing. I think we need to just keep track of that and hold on to that.
Thank you, Stuart. And so shout out to the people in the streets who are enacting abolition in there every day. That's such a wonderful final thought. Thank you everyone so much for being here, for spending your Thursday evening with us. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I've learned just so much from all of you. So hopefully there will be a chance to do this sometime in person. I'll hand it over to you, Phil, to say goodbye.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I think we'll know we're winning when Hollywood stops making cop shows. Actually, seriously, there's something to be said about that. But thanks to Omedy and to Stuart and to Paul and to Travis and to Paige. There's so many people on the call. I'm looking at the view here, but I can't see it. And to Charmaine, of course, for having this conversation. And also special thanks to the last dope intellectual, Charisse Burden-Stelly, for helping to put this together. And we hope to see you at the last 6 Red May discussions, which run through, I think, next Tuesday. Tomorrow morning, as I mentioned before, but I will mention again, we're having, of course, what happens to a tablet when the screen just keeps bouncing up but doesn't come down again? There we go. Debt after Graeber. One of the great casualties of the tragedies of the COVID, the pandemic, was the loss of David Graeber, a wonderful soul, who has left behind many books, but his book Debt is wonderful. And we have Max Haven, Cassie Thornton, Radhika Desai, Lee-Claire Laberge, and Andrew Ross. And then tomorrow at 3 p.m., What Just Happened? About the pandemic, the George Floyd rebellions, was it a coup on January 6th? Joshua Clover, Jody Dean, Theory of Francos, Idris Robinson, and Nikhil Pal Singh. So come and catch some of those, or go to our website and give us a little bit of cash so we can keep doing this. www.redmayseattle.org. Go to donate and follow the instructions. Thanks again to everybody. This is a wonderful conversation. And next year or the year after, live at the 6th or 7th or 10th Red May here. Thank you. Good night, everybody.